what I'm going to concentrate on today is communities engaged in low carbon transitions, and in a particular community we've been working with, which is Lammas Eco village in Pembrokeshire. Before I get on with that, I want to say thanks to both Fiona Sharani and Catherine Butler, who are my colleagues, who've really helped me put together these slides. And also, I often forget to do this, which is not a good thing. Thank you to the participants who made our study even possible. So what I'm going to do today is very briefly give you a project details, give you an overview of what we're doing, our aims and objectives, what sort of methods we've been employing. I'm going to give you a bit more information about Lammas Eco Village, just because I think it's quite important, just in case you haven't heard of it, about what sort of things they're trying to do. I'm then going to move into sort of the crux of the presentation, which is really about looking at inside and outside community. It sounds very simplistic, but actually there's an awful lot of nuances involved when you're thinking about internal community cohesion and also external perceptions of a community. And then I'll offer some tentative conclusions over what we think some of this might mean. Okay, so in terms of project details, Energy Biographies is, as the other projects here today, is part of the Energy and Communities funding call by the RC UK. We've been going since, I think, around October 2010, and we've got about another year left. We have 4 case sites across the UK, ranging from the niche in terms of the type of energy demand interventions that are taking place there, and the niche one being Lammas Eco Village, to the more mainstream. And along that sort of paradigm, as it were, there's continuing even, there are 2 case studies within Cardiff. There's Future Space in Ely and Kyra. Ely and Kyra is quite a deprived area of Cardiff. And then there's Peterston Super Ely. There's a group there called Peterston Connect, which is quite an affluent area of Cardiff. And both of those have come together around solar PV initiatives, at least initially. Future Space more around a community-led development, and Peterston Super Ely more around private ones, but coming together to help drive down the price of the actual units. And then our more mainstream again case site is staff from the Royal Free Hospital in London. So although the people themselves might not be involved in some sort of energy demand intervention in their homes, the hospital does have goals of sort of bringing down their carbon. They have to have 5-year carbon plans and so forth. And that sort of represents as well something I think quite important, is that when you're looking at people's energy practices, which is what we're doing, it's about looking at them within the different spaces and places they move within and between as part of their everyday lives. So all of our case site areas, all of our participants, we talk about not just energy in the home, we talk about travel, we talk about leisure and fun, outside and work. And in some senses, we're trying to sort of see if energy practices change. What the assumption is that they do, depending on the sort of spaces and places you move within and between. And why? Why does that happen? In terms of our sort of sample, we have, it's a qualitative longitudinal design, it's all qualitative. We have 74 participants that took part in the first phase. We've then gone back to a subset of participants in each case site area for over a year. They've been involved in 3 interviews, and in between the interviews we gave the longitudinal people multimodal tasks centred around photographs and text messages and so forth. I'm only going to really deal with the actual sort of interviews themselves from the first phase rather than the second and third. We made sure we had a mixed sample. The aim here is not to be representative, but it is to try and get a diverse sort of set of ideas and thoughts through that sample, through a spread. Okay, but what are we actually doing? I've sort of alluded to this a little bit. At its core, and I guess a little bit crudely put, we're trying to understand how people's energy practices come into being. We know they don't just suddenly start doing things in certain ways. So what is the driving force there? Where have they come from? And I guess it's interesting, one of the questions this morning is that we seem quite focused on energy demand reduction. I guess we've sort of been seduced into this as well in a sense, because we wanted to understand all of that to get some insight in how we could perhaps get people on more energy saving, energy friendly lifestyles, as it were. The reality is, I think, as all the speakers have alluded to throughout today, is that it's more complicated than that. So energy efficiency is just as important. So we're interested in that aspect as well. But what I kind of want to focus in on today, as you might have gathered, is the community aspect. It's understanding community configurations. What role does community play in sort of our energy practices? And that's what I will be focusing on in specific relation to Lammas Eco Village. All right, so to do that, to look at community configurations in relation to Lammas, I'm going to be talking about three sort of core themes. The perceptions of the Lammas community, both within and outside. We're going to be talking about dealing with the visibility of the Lammas project. I don't know how many of you have heard of it? So quite a lot of you. They've got quite an external presence. So, you know, how do they deal with that? And how does that sort of interact with what they're trying to do? Then also look at the sort of work involved in sort of forming and maintaining a community. Just to give you a bit of detail about Lammas, just in case you don't know that much about it. Lamis is a new settlement being developed on former farmland, and it's highly unusual because it's the first eco-village that's being given permission to form in that sort of way and given legal permission. It has planning permission. It was given planning permission after an initially prolonged planning struggle. The planning permission came from Pembrokeshire County Council, and they have a policy called Policy 52, Low Impact Development, and it's part of their joint unitary development plan. But actually, because Pembrokeshire County Council didn't want them to have planning permission, the main sort of way that they got it was through the Welsh Government's One Planet Development and 6 policy, which covers the whole of Wales. So there was a tension there between sort of local policy objectives and ideas and also national. Now, at the core of the planning permission that they've been given is that they must live low impact lifestyles. This includes in the building of the homes, the occupations, the way that they travel, all aspects of their lives. They have to calculate their carbon footprint. They also have to think about the different things that are coming into the site and take account of that. And most crucially, and probably the most difficult thing, is that 75% of their basic needs must come off the land. And they have to keep calculating that. Every resident has to calculate this. Now, they have to do that within 5 years. If they don't, theoretically speaking, planning permission for the whole site gets revoked. The site must be off-grid, it is off-grid, and it must remain off-grid to keep in with this as well, to keep in with the low impact. When they first moved onto the site, they had no running water, they had no energy provision, they had no tracks. They've had to put all of that sort of infrastructure in. What they did have was provision for a hydroelectric plant that needed work. So for the first 2 to 3 years, they only had energy from things like solar cells that were on their temporary accommodations, which would charge up batteries. Or they had things like wood burners, which they sourced from the communal woodland, or sort of gas canisters, or that sort of stuff for their heat. So at times they had very, very, very little energy. You know, sometimes, particularly during winter, some of the people didn't even have a light switch on. They would be, you know, living by torchlight, and we did some of the interviews that way. Okay, the other way that they could get a bit of energy is they had access to something called the clamp, which is a barn owned by their neighbour which is connected to the grid, so they could go and charge up their batteries or do that sort of thing, but very little. So obviously, what's interesting about Lamis is, typically in this sort of research, you sort of question, first of all, well, are they reducing demand? Well, we know actually Lamis is. They categorically have created some sort of initiative to massively reduce their energy demand. So what we really are interested in exploring with them is how and sort of what impact this has and whether it can be scaled out further. Okay, I'm going to start with outside perceptions. In the early days, there was a great deal of contestation surrounding Lammas. With many people close by to the site worried that Lammas would be a place full of hippies smoking dope and feral children running around, as the sort of quote alludes to, that there would be illegal activities taking place. Even when fairly reputable, I won't say completely reputable, news articles around extolling the sort of advantages of Lammas and what they're trying to do. There was an enduring perception that it would be a hippie commune. So even though the article itself goes on to talk about Lammas as a very different type of community and eco-village, the title itself, Modern Commune, sort of speaks to the fact that it's still associated with communal living. However, through a number of different strategies, Lammas have managed to change outside perception of the site. First and foremost, this was through being transparent, allowing others to see how they are well ordered and very well organised. Second, through opening Lammas up to outside visitors, allowing people to tour the site. They put on several tours a year, and in the first year, the first visit, over half the people that did visit were from the very local community surrounding the site. Apart from that, they've also made sure they've been involved in sort of local community activities, things like the duck race, which I'm quite intrigued about, and they've also been doing other activities like learning Welsh. So it's all about integrating themselves with the local community, opening themselves up, and not just being this closed site. So in that sense, and particularly, I don't know if you ever saw their website before it went through a recent change, they had a lot of information about themselves on there, about the actual people living on the site, the 9 households. They were very open about who and what they are and why they're coming to Lammas and what they aim to do. And in that sense, they sort of feel that people then got a handle of who they are and that they had this wider place in the local community. So they've done an awful lot to distance themselves from that notion of being a closed-off commune, and even down to deliberate strategies where people on the site would go to their neighbours and say, this is what we're doing tomorrow, this is why this digger's coming along, and so on and so forth. So a lot of work has been put into trying to make it clear who and what they are and what they're doing and why. If we turn to inside the community, hopefully you can see the sort of quote that's from the webpage there. They've also been trying to make it absolutely clear that the residents come from all walks of life. This is not a homogenous set of people. This is not the same type of people. Some have come from communes before, they've lived in similar circumstances. Other people have come from very mainstream walks of life, and they've tried to make it clear that that's the case. There isn't necessarily a shared ethos. They've been emphasising their independence from one another. So there isn't shared ethos necessarily, there aren't shared social values. Anybody can come, anybody can leave the village if they want to, the settlement. So in that sense, they're trying to sort of emulate a conventional village life, as it were. Residents also make clear that they don't have a shared value system, that it's not necessarily a harmonious hippie site, as the sort of end of that quote sort of states, which I won't say out loud. There are tensions, there are issues, there are challenges of living and working near to one another. Obviously what they're doing is a tremendous amount of work all at the same time, multiple areas, so it isn't always happy and harmonious. Now, despite distancing themselves quite deliberately from being seen as a commune, there are obviously aspects to living on the site which are related to communality. So they've had to put in that infrastructure I talked about earlier, the roadways, the water, the hydroelectricity, there's car sharing activities, and those sorts of things. And it's meant that they have to sort of cooperate and communicate together. But perhaps one of the most central aspects of a communal aspect to what they're doing is this shared planning target. It's absolutely essential, and as this quote sort of talks about, they are undertaking activities to share resources, ideas and skills. Interestingly, what we also found is not necessarily everybody on the site knew that this was a shared target. Some people felt they would be individually assessed. But actually, if one of the household fails, in theory all of them fail. So, in this sense, as I've already mentioned, Lammas is in some senses very exposed. Now, there are two sides to this exposure, this notoriety, as it were, of being very visible. One side is that some of the residents feel that they're likely to come under judgment from people who visit the site and question what they're doing and whether they're doing things in the correct way and are really eco. And so, you know, this sort of badge of being under Lammas sometimes can work against them and cause them quite a lot of tension and anxiety for the individuals involved. On the other hand, some of the people talked about how being part of Lammas is great because they are able to attract an awful lot of outside volunteer work. So volunteers flock to Lammas to share their skills, to also learn skills, to do the work on the land. All aspects of it is building their homes, working the land. So in that sense, this notoriety works for them. Okay, so it's two sides of the coin, really. Yeah, obviously, when you're developing a community as they are, I mean, initially they weren't a geographic community, but now they are increasingly becoming one. People are coming to this area, they're forming a place. It takes an awful lot of work. Some of the residents of Lammas felt that their neighbours weren't quite aware of the amount of work that it would take, that they felt like just by simply saying we're a community, they become one. So it's a fairly sort of negative sort of idea about community there. Others talked about the different ways that they are becoming a community, and again, re-emphasising that this isn't harmonious, it's not unproblematic, but nevertheless, they are coming together. Sometimes these challenges and issues that they have are what exactly make them a community, rather than sort of stopping them from being a community. And then lastly, some felt very much it was the case that people had deliberately chosen to come to the site and be involved in Lammas to be a good neighbour. So community was quite a central component to what they were doing. It's interesting because if you look at Lammas's vision, community is completely absent from that vision. Yet, for some people, it was a core reason as to why they attended Lammas and got involved in Lammas, rather than, for example, being eco or green. Okay. I started by talking about these different themes of perceptions of community. We've explored how communities have worked to challenge people's stereotypes, so the different definitions of community. Of the Lammas community has changed from being this hippie commune to one that is well organised. They obviously have done this through clear connections with people within the site, outside the area. With absent others, it's not just the people who have actually visited the site, take part in the site. You know, there are an awful lot of people, perhaps through the internet and so on and so forth, that have connected there. And they've done a lot of work to challenge those stereotypes. In terms of the visibility of the project, I've talked about how it can, in some senses, create an awful lot of pressure in terms of people's identities, but on the other sense, actually is an incredibly important part of making Lammas work through, for example, the volunteers getting involved. And obviously, in terms of forming community, it's ongoing. This is not a static community, they are not finished. They've got an awful lot of things that they're doing, they're continually changing and evolving. In terms of scaling up, it's interesting about Lammas because I was talking about this earlier with Rebecca. When I was thinking of going to Lammas, I thought it would be very unusual and different. And actually, one of the underlying things that have come out of our work with Lammas is how conventional they are and how conventional many of their aspirations are and how they connect with very conventional communities. So in terms of scaling up, what isn't unique about Lammas is these struggles that they've had in forming the community, isn't the challenges that they've faced in some ways, isn't the way that they work together and share skills and create friendships and sub-communities and have good neighbours. What's unusual about them is the planning context, so it isn't what's happening locally, it's nationally, and that tension within and between the national and the local. So if we're thinking about how to scale up, we obviously then have to pay quite careful attention to the national planning context. It's okay to create a policy that then provides the opportunity for these things, but if you're not going to support and help these communities form, it's kind of what is the point of having that policy in the first place? I think there are some wider lessons to, it's not just about how can we repeat Lammas, and Lammas itself are not interested in just thinking about how can this model go forward in the same way. It's also about thinking about the possibilities of having bursts of funding To me, what is quite important in terms of the implications of this sort of model, as it were, is that it isn't just about the money involved, it isn't just about that level of capacity, it's about continually supporting these sorts of initiatives. Increasingly we're seeing government policy turn to communities as the means by which change should occur. So if we're serious about that, which I think we are, we can't then just sort of go, well, here's a policy, go forth and do your thing. These communities need constant support, they need structural funds, as it were, that we often, sort of underpins a lot of university work. So I think in that sense, that challenge there, those difficulties apply across all community groups in all sorts of areas. It's not just related to energy or the environment. I think if we don't do that, the obvious danger is that this just becomes a thing that we say rather than a thing that we're able to do. And we actually stop really quite ingenious attempts of change from occurring. I'll leave it there. Thank you.